So my topic here this morning, or actually afternoon, is scientism and the need to acknowledge the limits of science. So over the last few years, we have seen, at least among philosophers, a certain trend towards what's sometimes called scientism. Scientism is a certain view it's basically an epistemological view. There are many bells and whistles can be added onto it, but the core message of scientism is that science is the only way to get into contact with reality. The only way to acquire knowledge of truth is by doing science, especially by doing one of the natural sciences. That seems to me, when I talk about this with my own philosophy students, they will think it's a silly view. But still, it's one thing to think it's a silly view. It's another thing to know why it is a silly view. And I also think that as a Christian, and as Christian academics, it's important that we have certain views as to what we may expect from science, and what we definitely should not expect from science. So I'm going to point to a number of limits, I call them, of science. But I want to make my first important statement that this is not at all intended to play down the value or the importance of science or doing science. When I play my guitar, I'm simply unable to get out of it the nice golden bronze sound that I may get out of a trumpet. That's not criticizing my guitar. It's simply indicating what I shouldn't expect from it. That's simply not the way the thing is supposed to sound. So when I'm pointing to certain limits of my guitar, I'm not criticizing it. In the same way, when I'm pointing to certain limits of science, I'm not criticizing science. My first preliminary point is science, what is it? I'm going to be very quick about this. Among philosophers, there is no consensus about what science is. There is this demarcation problem. Mention anything you think is characteristic of science, for instance, that it has explanatory value, that it works with theories, that it makes predictions. All of these things can be found outside of science as well. Still, I do think we have some sort of a working knowledge of what science is, even if it has vague boundaries. And although, in the main, I'm not a follower at all of David Hume, he made an important remark about vagueness. He said, at any 24-hour period of a day's time, it will be unclear whether it's day or whether it's night. There are these in between. But to conclude from that, therefore there is no day and there is no therefore nights don't exist, that would be folly. Well, there are certain things that surely qualify as science, and there are certain other things that surely don't qualify as science. In between, there's a lot of vagueness, but I suppose we all have a working knowledge of how to apply the notion of science. So, this is point 0. Science, what is it? I don't have anything really informative to say about this this morning. Now I want to point to 6 limits. The first limit I call a limit from extra scientific knowledge. This will take us a little bit into the field of epistemology. We pursue science, at least in part because we want to obtain knowledge. We want to acquire knowledge of the world, of the way things are. Now, what is it to know something? What's required for having knowledge? Well, many epistemologists, or by far all epistemologists that I know, will say something along the following lines. To know something is at the very least to believe something. You cannot know something unless you believe it. Right? I cannot know that the Earth has one moon and at the same time say, but I don't believe it. Right? Or I know that 2 + 2 = 4, but I don't believe it. I would be displaying some sort of a failure. Still, if I know something, then at the very least I believe it. But to believe something, it's insufficient for knowing it. For, some person may believe that the Earth has 2 moons, right? It has been argued that the Earth has 2 moons. Well, suppose it's false that the Earth has 2 moons. Then we wouldn't thereby conclude, therefore, well, the person believes that the Earth has 2 moons, hence he knows it to be the case that the Earth has 2 moons. No, in order for a belief to qualify as knowledge, what's believed must be true. That's the reason why no one, but then really no one can know that London is the capital of France, or that Amsterdam is the capital of the United States. No one can know that. It's false. Falsehood cannot be known. Still, having a true belief is still insufficient for knowing something. So here's an example to make that clear. Suppose I engage or I participate in a lottery. I buy a lottery ticket and I keep the lottery ticket in my hand. Let's say it's number 13. And somehow I start believing this is the winning lottery ticket. And lo and behold, it turns out to be the winning lottery ticket. Well, prior to the publication of the outcome of the lottery, did I know that the ticket I was having in my hand was the winning ticket? Well, no, it was just good luck that I happened to believe something, that I believed something that happened to be true. So in order to know something, it isn't only necessary that I believe it, that what I believe is true, it's also necessary that what I believe has some basis, or there's some evidence for it. It must be grounded upon something, not just my whim. You know, I just look at my hand, there's a ticket in it, and I believe it's the winning ticket. Well, that's crazy. Now, if we want to say what scientific knowledge is, then here's one way to think about it. It's a belief that we have. So we have scientific knowledge if there's a certain thing that we believe that is true, and that we have some grounds for it. When it comes to scientific knowledge, these grounds must be derived from science. It's knowledge, or it's true belief that derives from scientific investigation. What I've been saying so far is that what is knowledge? Well, the answer, or at least my answer, is it's true belief that is warranted. Let's call that additional thing that's needed over and above true belief warrant, and then we can say, we can analyze knowledge as warranted true belief. So my belief that this is the winning ticket that I'm holding in my hand prior to the number, prior to the winning ticket being publicized, or the winning number being publicized, that's a mere true belief. It isn't knowledge. What lacks is it has no warrant. So in order for a true belief to be scientific knowledge, it needs to have warrant deriving from science. So what would be examples of warrant provided by scientific investigation? Well, there would be, you know, the standard high school physics. There would be a lot of scientific evidence for that. For instance, that iron expands when heated, or that all metals expand when heated, or that air, when it's being heated, goes up. Or that water boils at around 100 degrees of Celsius under normal temperature pressure. Those are the sort of things that we have scientific evidence for. Also, a lot of evidence coming from inheritable or heritable traits, eye color, and those sort of things. That these traits, many of these traits, are inherited from one's parents. There's a lot of scientific evidence for that. Now, the question I'd like to ask, if this is scientific knowledge, if scientific knowledge is true belief, the warrant for which derives from science, then it should be obvious for each of us that there's a lot of things that we know that we don't know on the basis of scientific investigation. Let me go through a boring series of truisms. At least truisms for me. I know that my name is Rene van Woudenberg. Well, nothing by way of any sort of scientific investigation has gone into my acquisition of that true belief. Or I know that I'm married. Well, I didn't investigate that. Well, I investigate my wife, of course, as spouses should do. Study your wife, I once learned. or study your spouse. That was the thing. So I know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but not because I performed some sort of scientific investigation. I know that if A is taller than B and B is taller than C, that A is taller than C as well. I know this, but not through some sort of scientific investigation. I know that currently we're in Poland. Well, at least I think I know we're currently in Poland, but nothing by way of anything, nothing that qualifies as doing scientific investigation has gone into that. I know that honesty is much better than dishonesty. I know that promises ought to be kept and those sort of things. I know these things, but not because I have scientific evidence for it. Well, there's nothing against it. There's nothing against this type of knowledge. It's simply indicating that there are types of warrant that we can have for true beliefs of ours that don't derive from scientific investigation. There are so many different grounds you may have for the things that you know. And science is one very important among them, but it's certainly not the only one. Now, there are many things that we know in this extra scientific way or in this non-scientific way that we would be able also to know in a scientific way. For instance, I know that currently I have an unbroken arm. Well, I don't have any scientific evidence for that. But of course, if I were really serious about, or if I were unsure about whether I have an unbroken arm, well, I could go to a doctor, and he or she could put me through some machine and perform some tests on my arm, so that, well, on the basis of what that doctor did, let's say it's some form, or it qualifies as some form of scientific investigation, then I could also know in a scientific way that I have an unbroken arm. So some truths are such that although we can know them in an extra scientific way, they can also be known in a scientific way. And here's another example. If I now branch out and take a much more expansive notion of science, namely the German, Dutch, non-English notion of science, Wissenschaft or the Wetenschap, I know that my great-grandfather, he was a shipbuilder in, among other places, the harbor of Rotterdam. Well, I just know this from, it was handed over through family tradition. I never studied any documents. I didn't do anything that qualifies as serious historical research, but of course I could start doing that. And then again, I would have a scientific warrant or an academic or an intellectual warrant for what I already believed. So another example that it's possible to have a true belief that is such that although I do have a non-scientific warrant for it, I could also have obtained a scientific warrant for it. Now, an interesting question to think about is, are there truths that we know of that are such that we have only extra scientific warrant for them? Are there such truths? So truths that science simply will be unable to provide a warrant for. It seems to me that there are, let me just I'm going to use this a little bit later on, so let me give 3 quick examples. It seems to me that in the sphere of moral knowledge, right, I think we know that we ought to keep our promises. I think we know that honesty is much better than dishonesty. I know that an unjust act is worse than an unkind act. All right, there's more demerit in an unjust act than in an unkind act. These are the sorts of things that I think we know. These are cases of moral knowledge, and of course, all each in our own situation. There are many things we know. This is my obligation vis-a-vis this particular student. This is my obligation, or vis-a-vis my children, or my family, or the state. This is my obligation. And each of us knows these things, but not thanks to science. So moral knowledge derives its warrant from something else than scientific investigation. Other things you might think are like this have to do with things that I know about myself. So very often I know what I'm thinking about. or very often I know what sort of feelings I have. I know I have a mild headache sometimes. I know when I'm running, I have a little bit of problems in the back or something. I know these things. And when someone comes up to me and says, "Oh no, you weren't thinking, let's say, about an epistemological problem, but you were thinking about boat races, or you were thinking about the Dutch team not going to the European Championships the upcoming summer," well, I would simply not believe that person. Or when I'm saying, I feel a pain in my stomach, and Peter comes up and says to me, "No, it's not your stomach, it's your head you're feeling." Well, I simply would, the warrant that I have for this particular belief that trumps every other sort of grounds or evidence that people may come up with. Still, it's non-scientific. It's a non-scientific form of warrant. And finally, and this is what I'm going to suggest later on, Christian beliefs. Beliefs such as that God is the creator of the world, or that Christ is the second person of the Trinity, through whose magnificent work of atonement we can be free, and we can be living in the expectancy of eternal life. Those sort of things, I'm firmly convinced, are true. I believe them, and there's warrant for it. Where exactly the warrant comes from, that's a topic of very important and interesting and heated sometimes discussions among Christian philosophers and epistemologists over the last 2 decades, and I can talk a lot about that. But for now, the important point is only, whatever warrant these Christian beliefs have, they don't derive from scientific investigation. That's not bad, that's nothing against them. It's just acknowledging an obvious fact that there are so many types of warrant that true beliefs may have. So there is a limit. That's why I call it what I've been talking about. It's an argument for a limit of science. I call it there's a limit for science from the existence of extra scientific knowledge. And perhaps I could be even more specific by saying there's a limit from irreducibly extra scientific knowledge. It seems correct to say some things are such that it seems impossible that we can know them through scientific investigation. Like these moral truths about our own mental lives or physical experiences and religious Christian truths. Secondly, there's also a limit from knowledge by acquaintance. So many philosophers make this distinction. They say there is such a thing as knowledge of truth. So I know that the Earth is one moon. I know that iron expands when heated. I know that Heidegger was a German philosopher. I know that Amsterdam has fewer than 1 million inhabitants and the like. Those are truths that I know. But there's also another type of knowledge, another kind of knowledge. That's not knowledge of truth, but it's knowledge by acquaintance. And here are some examples to get the feeling. I may say that I know my wife, or that I know how, or I may say that I know that Italian wines generally taste a bit sweeter than French wines. Or I may say that I know Rembrandt's Night Watch. Or I may say that I know what it feels like to have sand in your hand, or to feel the sand between your toes, right when you're walking on the beach. These are things that I know, but they aren't knowledge of truth. So, for instance, if I were to tell you, I know Barack Obama, well, then it could be misleading, or at least the thing. Well, there are many truths I know about Barack Obama, right? He's a man, a male person. That's what I know. He seems quite tall. That's another thing that I know. But if I were to say, oh, well, I know Obama, then at the very least you would expect us to have shaken hands or to have come across each other, have some form of interaction. Well, I never interacted with Obama, but I did interact with the Pope. So I may say, well, I know the Pope, in addition to knowing many truths about the Pope. I know how water tastes and how it's distinct from how Coca-Cola tastes or how beer generally tastes. Well, whatever knowledge of truths science will be able to give us, science is unable to give us knowledge by acquaintance. Or rather, you would think that if there is to be such a thing as the color of the science of colors, then there should be, on the part of scientists, be acquaintance with the phenomena of color. So we cannot do science unless we are acquainted with things, unless we have these first-hand experience. At least many parts of science are such that you can't pursue science or you can do it unless you have this knowledge by acquaintance of phenomena. I think this is an important point. There was an Australian philosopher of the name Frank Jackson, and he wrote a beautiful little essay with the title, What Mary Didn't Know. Now, Mary is a physicist, and she's especially interested in color perception. Now, here's Mary's predicament. She is born into a black and white environment. So the room that she lives in, the house she lives in, it's all black and white painted. Her parents, they applied only black and white paint to their faces. The colors were only black and white. She is instructed in physics through a black and white television screen. And as I said, she was very much interested in knowing all phenomena having to do with perception. Now suppose that the physics of perception is completed. And Mary knows everything there is to know about perceptual processes. She knows about light waves striking the retina. She knows about all the neurological machinery that's being set into motion after that. Suppose she knows all that. Now, here was the question that Frank Jackson tried to answer. He says, suppose now that Mary is released from her black and white environment. The door is open, and she sees for the first time green grass in her life and the blue sky. Will she learn something new? Or could she have anticipated from what she was instructed about from the black and white television instructors and black and white books? Or could she have anticipated what it was like for grass to look green? Could she have predicted what it was for the air to look blue? Well, Jackson said, if physicalism is true, or if naturalism is true, then if you know all the natural facts, or if you know all the physical facts, then you know all the facts. And he said, but Mary couldn't have anticipated what it was for grass to look green. And she couldn't have anticipated what it was like for the sky to look blue. Therefore, she didn't know all there is to know, and therefore physicalism is false. Naturalism is false. Well, among philosophers, there's been a lot of discussion about what is called these qualia, or the experiences of qualia. But I do think it points to a very important fact. There is knowledge that we have that we don't acquire through scientific investigation, although many instances of this type of knowledge form the foundation or the basis or are necessary requirements for being capable of doing science. And the link with Christianity and the Christian faith is this. Christians believe not only these articles, these things that we proclaim when we say the creed, let's say the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed or the Constantinople Nicene Creed. So we believe that the earth, or that God is the creator of the earth, the heavens and the earth, etc. There's also this other type of knowledge that the Psalms speak about. For instance, Psalm 25, where the knowledge of God is spoken about in terms of acquaintance. The Lord's familiar engagement, and I only know it in Dutch, the Dutch biblical verse. Des Heeren vertrouwelijke omgang is met wie hem vrezen. So I do speak Dutch. So the Lord's special, no, not attributes, engagement. Does anybody know Psalm 25 by heart? No. Anyways, then look at a particular verse. So there is this special type of knowledge that isn't propositional in nature, but it has to do with contact, with interaction. Yeah, something like experience. Yeah, I don't know what I should have looked it up. No, so this is a different point. So the first point was about what is scientific knowledge, and then I said, well, scientific knowledge is at the very least true belief, for which there is a scientific warrant. And now the second point is, well, there is such a thing as scientific knowledge. I have no doubt about that. But in addition, there are other types of knowledge that science cannot give. So that's another limit of scientific knowledge. Now we move on. I'm urged to move on to the third. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to repeat the question. Does this second limit of knowledge, or the second limit from knowledge by acquaintance, have anything to do with the previous point about knowledge?
Definition.
So here I take on another definition of knowledge. So the first limitation had to do with propositional knowledge or knowledge of truth, whereas secondly, in the second point, there's a limitation also for scientific knowledge, in this particular respect that it cannot give us knowledge by acquaintance, although it's based on it. It's needed for it. The third limitation I'd like to point to is that if we are to do science, we rely on certain presuppositions for which we have no scientific warrant. We rely on certain presuppositions that science hasn't proved to us. But in order for science to be able to prove anything at all to us, we need these presuppositions. I say this because so often when Christians in academic circles are being called to explain why they believe what they believe, they will say, well, but there's no scientific evidence for it. That will be a main charge. What I'm saying is, well, perhaps for certain things that Christians believe, or I'm sure for many things that Christians believe, there is no warrant can be derived from science. At the same time, science itself is based on presuppositions that cannot be proved. And I'm going to show, however quickly, I'm going to suggest, however quickly, that they cannot be proved indeed. For instance, when we do science, one of the things we do is that we argue. For instance, we use very elementary forms of logical reasoning. For instance, we use modus ponens, which says if P and Q entails Q and P is the case, then so must Q be the case. All right? In an example, if it rains, the street will get wet. It's raining, therefore the streets will get wet. That's a logical inference. We rely on it all the time. It isn't the case that we first start, as scientists, we start working on, well, can we accept modus ponens? Should we do that? And are we saying to ourselves, well, we don't accept modus ponens unless we have scientific evidence for modus ponens? No. We don't do that for at least two, and we cannot do that for at least two reasons. The elementary truths of logic, if they are true at all, they are necessarily true. They could not have been false. As we philosophers sometimes like to say, the elementary principles of logic, they are true in all possible worlds. They could not have been false. Here's another principle that we work with all the time, the principle of identity. P is P. Everything is what it is and not something else. That's the principle we work with all the time. It's a principle of logic, a very elementary principle. It's true, and it's necessarily true, right? This sheet of paper couldn't have been anything else than this particular sheet of paper. So we work with it all the time. There cannot be scientific evidence for this principle of identity or for modus ponens for the following reason, that whatever evidence we have from coming from science, that'll be contingent evidence. So, and it'll be evidence for, at least so it seems to be, for contingent truth. So truth that although, well, they are truth, it's nonetheless conceivable that it would not be true. So for instance, we think there is a lot of scientific evidence for under ordinary circumstances, that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. There's a lot of evidence for that. Still, it isn't necessarily true that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. It could have been boiling at other degrees, and we know that under other circumstances, water boils, but under normal circumstances, 1 atmosphere, etc. So it's contingent. And here's the important thing. You cannot prove the truth of a necessary truth by adducing evidence that itself is only contingently true. You can't move from contingent truth to necessary truth. So, and there's a second reason why we cannot prove the principles of logic. Many principles of logic, they have this inferential character, like modus ponens. There are many other logical principles. Now, if we were urged to prove these principles, we would have to engage ourselves in forms of reasoning, the conclusion of which would be modus ponens is valid, or other logical principles are valid. Which means we can only get at those conclusions provided we have already accepted certain forms of inference. And it's these forms of inference itself that are at stake. Well, nothing against these principles. It only shows that there are other ways in which it's rational to accept the principles of logic than by having contingent empirical evidence for them. That's all it shows. But it does show that if you are saying, like friends of scientism are saying, we don't accept anything until it's being scientifically proven, well, you get in a very strange predicament. Another presupposition of science is this: that we must assume that our cognitive faculties are more or less reliable. So we needn't assume that they are 100% reliable, but we must assume that they are pretty reliable. Suppose our faculties were completely unreliable. How could we ever prove that whatever sort of evidence we are finding by means of conducting scientific research would lead to true conclusions? How could we do that? in order to make such an argument, we would have to rely on certain of our faculties. So suppose I start by distrusting my eyes or my visual eyesight, or I start distrusting my abilities to understand what people are saying. I may be completely deluded when people say, well, if I do that, how can I even start doing science? But then, is there scientific evidence for the reliability of our basic faculties? Well, the point is, you cannot prove that unless you have some sort of initial trust in the reliability of our faculties. So this is a somewhat technical, philosophical point that is beautifully made by a philosopher from whom I've learned a lot, of the name William Alston, or Bill Alston. He wrote a little book in the 1990s with the title The Reliability of Sense Perception. And there he's arguing that we cannot, in a non-circular way at least, show that perception, our memory, our reasoning abilities are reliable procedures. Or at least we cannot show them to be reliable unless we presuppose them to be reliable. We're moving in a circle. I'll skip the third presupposition of science, that nature behaves uniform. That's something we assume, but I'm going to abstract from that. So there is this third limit of science. There's a limit for science in this particular sense, that science cannot prove the truth of a number of its presuppositions. There's a limit from ultimate questions. When you think about science, you can think about it as the enterprise to answer questions. And these questions are very different sorts of questions. They're questions about how matter behaves, or about numbers of things. So how many genes does the human genome have? It's questions about causalities, about probabilities, questions of very many different sorts, or where for the very first time something occurred. So scientific questions are of a bewildering variety. Still, what should be clear is there are questions that we're asking ourselves all the time, and that are such that they are meaningful questions, but just going at them in a scientific way isn't going to help answering them. I mean, this is obviously connected to the first point, but just getting at it from a slightly different angle, namely by thinking about science as the enterprise of answering answers, trying to find answers to questions. Well, some of these questions, these persisting questions that don't go away, even though many philosophers have tried to make them go away, have to do with meaning of life. What gives value to our existence? Why are we here on earth? Does God exist? These may not be the questions to which science has anything informative to say. That doesn't mean they are therefore silly questions, as the neo-positivists between the two world wars have tried to have suggested by wielding their verification principle of meaningfulness. Well, it may be that there are very good questions to which there are serious answers. It's only that science isn't going to tell them. Science isn't going to provide them for us. In a way, it feels like I'm kicking in open doors all the time. But in the intellectual context that I find myself in, it often also feels like I'm kicking in open doors that others didn't know were open. So then I hope that it's still to some good effect that I'm saying these things. So among philosophers, this has been a very important point, because many or philosophers of science, they, or at least a number of them, they have tended to say these things like something only qualifies as a good answer to a serious question, provided there is scientific evidence for it. These questions about meaning, these questions about values, these questions about importance, these questions about God, they simply cannot be answered in that way, and therefore there must be something wrong with the question itself. Right? The dominant attitude became, when a question cannot be answered by scientific investigation, there must be something wrong with the question. Like there's something wrong with the following question: where does your lap go once you stand up? Well, where does your lap go when you stand up? Well, you don't have to take that question very seriously, right? Or, well, I had a dream last night, and I was just wondering the weight of the dream. Was it 1 kilo or 2 kilos? Oh, that's something wrong with the question itself. And many of these positivists, they said, well, these questions about meaning, they may seem like meaningful questions or important questions or intelligible questions, but since science cannot answer them, they therefore are, in fact, meaningless questions. Well, so they gave a criterion for answering questions. My response is, well, they had a criterion for distinguishing between meaningful and meaningless questions, and this criterion was to help them to sort out these meaningful from meaningless questions. My response is, well, it's so obvious that there are certain meaningful questions that cannot be answered through science that there must be something wrong with the criterion. It isn't that these questions about the meaning of life and the like should go out of the window. It's the criterion that should go out of the window. And it isn't written somewhere in the scientific stars that this is the hallmark of science is that we work with this criterion. The scientific stars simply don't say these things. A limit from inexplicable brute facts. Science and scientists aims to explain certain things. That's not the whole of science, but it's an important part of science. We look for explanations. Now, what is it to explain something? Well, there are many theories about scientific explanation, but here's one of them. It's not the whole truth about scientific explanation, but it's at least partly true of scientific explanation. If we want to explain a certain thing, we should do two things. We should identify a law of nature or a set of laws of nature, and we should identify specific initial conditions. And once we have these two in place, and we can derive from them a certain particular fact that we should like to explain, then therefore we have provided the explanation. Here's an often used example. If I want to explain a certain pattern of shadow on the grass, I can explain it by reference to the laws of light and the specific initial conditions of, let's say, a flagpole that's casting its shadow on the grass. So the idea is I've explained this particular shadow pattern on the grass by making a reference to laws of nature, in this particular case, the laws of the propagation of light, and also such obvious things as that light doesn't travel through opaque objects like flagpoles, and the specific initial conditions, in this particular case, the position of the light source, the shape of the object that's casting the shade on the grass. If I have identified these two things, I have thereby explained the shadow on the grass. So scientific explanations, at least one type of scientific explanation, consists in identifying, or in order to make certain scientific explanations, you need to refer to laws of nature. But then, shouldn't there be an explanation of the laws of nature? Why does light propagate in the particular way that it does propagate? Well, there are some higher order level laws that may be invoked in order to explain that. And there may be even higher order level laws that explain those laws that explain the laws of the propagation of light. But somewhere this regression must end. Which means we are looking for a scientific explanation of some physical fact. We make a reference to laws. But if we go up high enough, we don't have any further explanations of the highest laws that we invoke. So we explain by invoking something that goes unexplained. So somewhere the explanatory regression has to stop. That's what I call an inexplicable brute fact. So if we think about explanations along the lines that I've suggested, namely I've explained something the moment I have made a successful reference to a law or certain laws, various laws of nature and specific initial conditions, if an explanation consists in those references, well then these laws highest up, there won't be a scientific explanation for them. Nothing against all these lower level explanations, but there is a law. There's a limit for science here. Now you might think, sure, these most general laws of nature, they are simply brute facts. They are inexplicable. On the other hand, you might also say, well, there is another sort of explanation available to human beings that's not of this particular sort of invoking general laws and specific initial conditions, but there is a sort of explanation available to human beings that consists of intentions, of reasons, of aims. For example, I come in my office and I see and I notice there's a book lying on my desk. I didn't put it there. So I asked my wife, why is the book there? Or who put the book there over there? And her answer is, well, it's our son who put it there. He wants you to read it and give your opinion about it. That's an explanation of the book's occurrence on my desk. But it's not a scientific explanation of the sort. I'm not invoking a general law. Well, books don't generally appear on desks, and I'm not nothing of the sort. It's an explanation of the presence of the book on my desk. In this particular sense, that the explanation identifies an agent who wants something, who intentionally brought about the state of affairs and in a way puts a question to me. These intentional explanations, they occur all the time. In ordinary life, we make these intentional explanations ubiquitously. So why is this thing here on my belly? Well, someone put it there with a very specific purpose of being understandable, or being capable, or with a very specific purpose of this talk being capable of being videotyped. That's an intentional explanation. No invocation of general laws and the specific initial conditions. Now you might think that when it comes to the most general laws of nature, or the most abstract laws of nature, there's an intentional explanation for them as well. Theists may say, well, this is the way God designed the universe. The fundamental laws of nature are the way they are because that's the way God intended to design the cosmos. I'm not saying it's intellectually required to make that further step, but I'm also saying, but I'm also not saying that it's intellectually lazy or irrational to make that further step. And here's a big field between philosophers of science, or over which philosophers of science disagree. So if you think that, so philosophers of science will agree that personal explanations, or intentional explanations as they're usually called, these intentional explanations, they have a certain validity within certain bounds. Why can they also be valid outside of the usual bounds, the human social atmosphere? And as you are no doubt fully aware of, there have been discussions over the last 20 years about the entropic principle, and the discussion is really about, well, the laws of nature and the constants in the laws of nature simply don't seem to be necessary numbers. Which means the laws of nature aren't necessarily the way they are. And if they're contingent, then it fits very nicely in a world picture in which God creates and sustains and wants things to be in particular ways. So, personal explanations I don't think are irrational. At the same time, I don't think that everyone is required to make them. But those who make them cannot be accused of irrationality. At least I don't think so. May I ask the person responsible for the time how we are doing time-wise? 15 minutes. So then I make a bold suggestion, skip over the 6th limit and simply say that by thinking about these limitations that I suggest exist for science, 2 important points are sprinkled with cold water. I mean, I'm not meaning baptized. I'm saying they're sort of, the acuteness of them is taken out. First, there's a problem. So it throws cold water on the claim that science lends no warrant to Christian faith. And therefore, since it doesn't, Christian faith should be remodeled or should be reconceived in terms that are more scientific in nature. And it also throws cold water on the claim that it's a problem. It also throws cold water on the claim that science provides defeaters, so underminers or undercutters for Christian belief. So in the Q&A, if there is going to be a Q&A, we could talk about, for instance, the notion of chance. So in my home university, I had a long argument with a biologist who said, Rene, you talk about the meaning of life, but biology has indicated that life is meaningless. Because mutations occur randomly. I think that all of us know enough about these things that, well, when biologists talk about random mutations, they have a very technical definition of randomness. It has nothing to do with this grander philosophical points about things having no value or having no meaning. And also, what's important is that even if science is to put pressure on Christian faith, at the same time, there are those things that lend warrant to the Christian belief that put pressure back. So the moment we are sensitive to the limitations of science, well, then I think we have and there are so many common sense reasons for acknowledging the limitations of science, then I do think that Christians in the academic life, may have done a good job by pointing out to something that's very obvious, and at the same time, that helps them to illustrate why believing in Christ can be a very sensible, rational, eminently healthy thing to do.